eject, reject, project, projectile, interject. All 5 of these words have a single word part that they share in common, JECT. Interesting. So, what does JECT mean? Keep listening to find out. Thanks for listening to Master English with Tim, where every Monday I teach you intermediate to advanced English in depth and detail and without ever hurrying. So, in this week's episode, I am going to tell you about 16 different words that include the Latin root ject, which is spelled J-E-C-T. This root means throw, and when you hear or see ject in a word, it usually has some connection with throwing or flying. In some words, the root is a bit shorter and becomes jet, which is spelled J-E-T. So let's start with one of the 16 words that very clearly illustrates the meaning of this root ject. This word is projectile. That's P-R-O-J-E-C-T-I-L-E, projectile. A projectile is anything that we throw or anything that we use as a weapon by throwing it or making it fly. So, a bullet is a projectile. Rockets and missiles are projectiles. Arrows are projectiles. And if someone throws a rock at someone, then the rock is a projectile. And you know what? Even a tomato can be a projectile if you throw it at someone. All right, let's now move on to some more commonly used words with this root ject. So our first common word with the root ject is eject. If you eject someone, you force them to leave a place. In other words, you throw them out. For example, if some football fans are behaving really badly at a game, yelling bad words and throwing projectiles and fighting with fans from the other team, then the police might come and eject those fans from the stadium, which just means that the police make them leave the stadium. Or a completely different situation. If 2 countries have a really difficult relationship, then one country might eject the other country's diplomats from its territory or force them to leave. Another context where you can see or hear the word eject is in military aviation, and specifically with fast fighter planes, like a Sukhoi or an F-16 or a Chengdu, depending on which team we are talking about. If one of these planes is badly damaged and is going to crash, the pilot can eject from the plane, which means that the pilot leaves the damaged airplane using a seat with a small rocket engine on the bottom of it. That seat, by the way, is called an ejection seat. Another interesting word that comes from eject is ejecta. That's E-J-E-C-T-A. Ejecta is a noun that is used in geology and astronomy. In geology, ejecta is material that flies out of a volcano when the volcano explodes. For example, when the famous volcano Vesuvius erupted near Pompeii in 79 AD, hot ejecta came and covered the city, killing everyone who was still there. Some of the ejecta was hot ashes. Some of the ejecta was flying pieces of hot stone. Like I said, we also use ejecta in astronomy, and it has a similar meaning. Some astronomers think that 4.5 billion years ago, another planet that was maybe 1/3 the mass of the Earth came and hit our planet. It flew right into us. When the Earth and this other planet hit each other, it made a huge explosion, and billions of tons of rock flew out into space. This ejecta from the explosion then was pulled together by gravity, and in just a day or two, the ejecta formed our moon that we can see in the sky tonight. Okay, let's move on to our next family of words with the root ject. The first word in this family is reject. That's R-E-J-E-C-T, reject. If you reject someone or something, you say no to it. You do not accept it. So if someone at work takes a romantic interest in you and you already have a boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, then you would reject this person. Or imagine that you are a history teacher and you ask your students to write a long paper about Greece or Rome. One of your students writes a really bad paper. It looks like the student just used ChatGPT to write the whole thing. In that case, you would reject the paper. You would say, no, I will not take it. Or another situation, maybe you're a new employee at an office and you request vacation right away and at the busiest time of the year. In that case, your boss might reject your vacation request. The noun of reject is rejection. Rejection always feels bad. Rejection feels bad when it comes from a friend or a romantic partner or someone we're interested in. We have another noun from the verb reject. This noun is reject. So in this noun, the stress is on the first part of the word. So again, reject. A reject is a person that no one wants to talk to or be friends with. A reject can also be a product like a shoe or a banana or a toy car that is of such low quality that it cannot be sold. So a shirt, for example, might be a reject because the buttons are too high for the holes that they are supposed to go into. Usually, I guess, factories just throw away or burn rejects. We have another noun that includes the root ject. This noun is dejection. Dejection is a negative emotion. If a person is in a state of complete dejection, then they feel that no one cares about them and that there is no hope for the future. So yes, dejection is a type of very deep sadness, although it might only be temporary. Alright, now let's talk about one of my favorite words, not just with the root ject, but also in English generally. This word is conjecture. That's spelled C-O-N-J-E-C-T-U-R-E. Conjecture. Conjecture is an explanation for a past event which has little or no supporting evidence. In other words, no solid reasons for believing something. For instance, let's imagine that the year is not 2025, but instead that we are in the time of the Egyptian pyramids. When we look up at the sky, we can see the moon and the stars, and also some planets like Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and so on. But people back then could not go up in the sky or into space, they could not fly, so they didn't know how close or far the stars and planets were. They had no way of knowing, and any idea they had about those distances was complete conjecture. In other words, it was a guess. And if those ancient people said that there were more planets in space than the 6 or 7 that they could see, then of course they were right, but what they said was still conjecture because they couldn't see that far away. Let's look now at two words that use a slightly different version of the root ject. These words do not include the k sound that you hear in ject, and instead just use jet. The first word is in fact simply jet, spelled J-E-T. A jet is a type of motor or engine used on airplanes. The first airplanes did not use jet engines, they used propeller engines. Propeller engines used what looked like 3 or 4 big knives that moved in a circle to make the airplane move. But starting in the 1930s, some military airplanes started to use jet engines, and in fact, nowadays, most airplanes, and not just military ones, use jet engines. We call them jet engines because jet engines throw out a dense stream of air behind them to make a plane move forward. And also, if an airplane uses jet engines, we can simply call the whole airplane a jet. So, some really rich business people have their own personal jets for transporting themselves. The other word that uses the jet version of the root ject is a verb, and that verb is jettison. That's written J-E-T-T-I-S-O-N, jettison. If you jettison something, it means that you throw it away or drop it from a bike, car, boat, plane, or even a spaceship. Sometimes in science fiction movies, you can also see situations where people are traveling on a spaceship and one of the people dies. So the people who are still alive jettison the dead person into the blackness of outer space. It's very frightening and sad, and feels very final. You could also say, in a metaphorical sense, that a corporation that is trying to be more profitable jettisons unneeded employees. Another word that's closely related to flying and has the full version of the root JECT is trajectory. That's trajectory, trajectory. To understand what a trajectory is, imagine that a projectile, let's say a green apple, is flying through the air. As the projectile is flying, it draws a line in the air. That line is the projectile's trajectory. This is obviously a very specific meaning, but we have a metaphorical meaning of trajectory that is much more common. We also say that a person, a career, or an organization has a trajectory. In this sense, trajectory means the ups and downs, the successes and failures that someone has. Okay, here's another word with the root ject. Interject, which is a verb. That's spelled interject, interject. You probably recognize the prefix inter in this word, which means between. You can find this prefix in the word, for example, international. But back to the word interject. Imagine that you are in a conversation with two other people. The other two people talk, and you usually are just listening. While one person is talking, you think of something that is important for the conversation, and then you say your idea. Maybe you ask the other's permission to talk, or maybe you don't and you just speak. In either case, when you throw yourself into a conversation in this way, you interject. Some people really don't like interjections. For me personally, interjections are okay if they bring something valuable to the conversation. Okay, let's talk about another pair of words with ject. This pair is inject and injection. So that's inject, and so that's inject, and injection, injection, injection. And so these words, inject and injection, are most often used in medical contexts. When a doctor injects medicine into someone's body, the doctor pushes a long, thin, sharp metal needle through a person's skin and then pushes medicine through the needle so that the medicine enters a person's body. A doctor might inject a vaccine or inject something that makes a person sleep for an operation, or they might inject blood to replace blood that a person has lost. We can also say that the stuff that a doctor or nurse puts inside your body is an injection. Right now, you might be thinking, now wait a minute, how is an injection connected with throwing or flying? Well, this is a great question, and actually these two words, inject and injection, show an important general fact about some Latin roots, which is that sometimes words with this or that Latin root have a meaning that does not have an obvious, solid connection to the meaning of the root. This happens because Latin was spoken a long time ago, and meanings of words with these roots have changed over the centuries. And honestly, maybe some of the uses of the roots were not always logical. Generally, we can't expect language to always be logical because language is made by people. So, before I finish for this week, just let me list several more words that contain the root ject, but that have a meaning that isn't obviously connected with throwing or flying. Object, object, objective, subject, subject, subjective, project, project. You hopefully noticed that the stress in these words sometimes changed from the beginning of the word to the end. In fact, that happens from time to time in English, and it is a phenomenon which I think I might talk about next week. Thank you everyone for listening, and see you next Monday.